Is the repo market signaling the next Lehman moment? And to find that out, we want to focus on the prime dealers. Those are the banks designated by the Federal Reserve to buy treasuries from the government. They're basically the market makers. So the government spends all this money, which we know they do extremely well. That's about the only thing they do well. But they're spending all this money, and to get this money, they need to sell debt or treasury bills or bonds. So the primary dealers, these market makers, buy a lot of these bonds from the government, and they take some of those bonds and they sell them to the Federal Reserve. The Federal Reserve gives them money for those bonds, and then they use that money to buy more government debt. What's unique about these primary dealers, because they are market makers, they get these treasuries for a bit of a discount. So they can buy these treasuries, and whether they flip them to the Fed or up to the treasury market, they're making profit right there. And they can take that cash and then go down and lend that cash on a short-term basis into the repo market at even a higher rate of interest than they would get by holding those bonds. Let's revisit how the repo market works. You've got all these banks that at some time can need cash to fulfill their reserve requirements that they have with the Federal Reserve. And this is usually on a short-term basis, just overnight. So this bank A, let's say he needs some money to meet his reserve requirement. So he says, hey, I need the cash. So he goes into the repo market and he says, I've got this collateral. We'll say that it's a bond. I've got this collateral and I just need some quick cash overnight. Usually the primary dealers and other people, but mostly the primary dealers, they would see this and say, oh wow, I just sold this treasury out to the market. I made a nice tidy profit there. Now I can take that cash and inject it into the repo market, buy this bond from this bank that needs the cash overnight. Then the primary dealer will get that cash back and they've got a double profit. It's really a neat deal for the primary dealer. But as we know, in September, the interest rate spiked from 2% in the repo market up to 10%. What that tells us is there's a lot of demand for cash and no cash to go around, or no cash to be lent, or no cash that was willing to be lent. There's been a lot of excuses floating around the media as to why this could have happened. A lot of them revolve taxes or other recurring events, and I don't really buy that. Because again, those are events that happen every year or every quarter. So why would this all of a sudden be a problem? Another more plausible explanation is that Trump and the current government is running trillion-dollar deficits. So they're flooding the market with all of these bonds because the government is spending so much more money. Well, remember that the Federal Reserve at this same time was doing quantitative tightening. That was when they were reducing the size of their balance sheet. So they had all these bonds that they owned, and they were in the process of selling these bonds into the market, taking that money from the market and basically incinerating it. So they're reducing the money supply. So while the current government is running these massive deficits and flooding the market with these bonds, the Federal Reserve is reducing the supply of money. So you have this situation where there's far more bonds and a lot less money in circulation to buy those bonds. And although this explanation makes logical sense, I don't think it's the answer. Because to me, this isn't something that would A, happen overnight, or B, the Fed couldn't see coming. If you're the Fed, you know the federal government is running massive deficits. You know that you're doing quantitative tightening to specifically reduce the supply of money that's in the system. So can't you see this coming from a mile away? What makes more sense to me is go back to focusing on these primary dealers and ask yourself, why on earth would they not want this quick profit of flipping these treasuries into the market, taking that cash, putting it into the repo market, and then making a double profit? Well, if I'm in their shoes, to me it boils down to one of three reasons. Either they're getting a higher return or a potential higher return on the bonds that they are holding. So you say, well, how would they do that? Well, think about this. We've got two ways to make money on a bond. They can either flip it into the market and make that little bit of spread, or if they're holding this bond and the interest rate on that bond suddenly plummets, the value of that bond would skyrocket. So you'd say, well, what would make the interest rate on these bonds plummet? What would make the Fed drop interest rates from 1.5% right now, boom, all the way down to 0? Lehman moment. The next one, maybe they think it's too risky to lend to bank A, B, C, D. Maybe they know something that we don't about their solvency. Again, that goes back to maybe it's a Lehman moment, where these primary dealers themselves are having liquidity issues and they don't want to take that cash that they have on hand and send it into the repo market because they themselves have these reserve requirements with the Federal Reserve. I want to be very clear. I'm not saying that the repo market is for sure telling us that we're having a Lehman moment. I'm presenting this to you so you guys understand how this plumbing works, and so you can come to your own conclusion as to what on earth is happening in the repo market. Because one thing that I do know for sure is that it's big. This is a very big deal. For more information on the repo market, check out this content right here, and I will see you on the next video.